He walked into the courthouse for a business deal, but walked out with a 6-year-old boy who quietly whispered, "Nobody wants me." Millionaire Grayson Holt never planned on becoming a father. But that day changed everything, for him, for the boy, and for a house where laughter had never lived. This isn't a story about being a hero. It's a story about choice, about courage, about how love can grow from even the deepest pain. Watch until the end. You won't forget this ending. The towering courthouse loomed against a cloudy morning sky, its concrete facade casting a shadow over the downtown streets. Inside, a symphony of clicking heels, rustling paperwork, and murmured legal jargon filled the air. Security guards stood motionless by the scanners, their gazes vacant but watchful. Clerks shuffled papers with the kind of fatigue that only years of bureaucracy could etch into a person's soul. It was a normal weekday by all appearances, efficient, procedural, and soulless. Grayson Holt stepped into the building with the quiet authority of someone who never had to explain himself. CEO of Holt Development Group and one of the wealthiest self-made men on the West Coast, he was the kind of person who made things happen with a single phone call. Dressed in a steel gray suit with a custom fit, his posture was immaculate and his expression unreadable. Every inch of him radiated discipline and precision. He hadn't come for drama, just a zoning appeal update, paperwork mostly, regarding a riverfront property in the city's industrial zone. It was a routine appearance, one he normally delegated, but a last-minute change had required his presence. His driver waited at the curb, engine running. His assistant had already messaged 3 times, warning that the investor lunch was not one to miss. 10 minutes. That was all he planned to be inside. He passed security, bypassed the crowd with a courteous nod to the clerk who knew his face from years of litigation, and strode through the second-floor corridor. Then he slowed. Near courtroom 3C, against a wall of institutional beige and steel-framed signage, was a bench, and on that bench sat a child, still as a stone and small enough to disappear into the visual monotony of the courthouse. Grayson wouldn't have noticed the boy if not for the strange contrast of silence around him. No adult nearby. No one glancing back. No one bending down to check on him. He was just there. Alone. The boy's knees were drawn tightly to his chest, arms wrapped protectively around them. His sneakers were dirty and frayed, one shoelace dangling limply. A green backpack, old and faded, slouched next to him on the bench like it had given up trying to stay upright. His dark hair fell unevenly across his forehead, and his face was streaked with the trails of dried tears. Grayson stopped walking. It wasn't the kind of scene you ignored, not when the rest of the corridor buzzed with legal urgency and disinterest. There was something about the way the boy sat, too quiet, too still, that unnerved him. He glanced around, expecting to see a parent nearby. Nothing. Just public defenders and clients with coffee-stained folders, each too busy with their own burdens to notice a child vanishing into the fabric of institutional apathy. For a brief moment, Grayson considered moving on. He had done his share of charitable work. His name was on hospitals and shelters. But this wasn't a scheduled donation or a planned ribbon cutting. This was real, raw, immediate. The boy looked up as if sensing Grayson's gaze, and then, without being asked, he said something, quietly, not with a cry or a plea, just a statement of painful clarity that froze Grayson in place. "My parents don't want me anymore." It wasn't a tantrum. It wasn't dramatic. It was a flat truth spoken the way some people announce the weather. A simple, irreparable fact. Grayson couldn't look away. Moments later, after alerting a nearby clerk and requesting someone from family court, he found himself in a small back office holding a paper cup of bitter coffee that had gone cold in his hand. The senior clerk, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes behind tortoiseshell glasses, entered with a manila file. She explained the situation with an efficiency that only long exposure to tragedy could create. The boy's name was Elliot. 6 years old, no known relatives, no special needs diagnosis, just another child whose parents had relinquished rights in the middle of a heated custody battle. His mother and father had signed a mutual waiver that morning, citing financial and personal incompatibility. They'd each rejected sole custody. Neither had wanted to be responsible for raising him. The judge, lacking any legal objection, had approved the waiver. The parents had left the courthouse immediately after the ruling, separately. They hadn't said goodbye. The system was already in motion. Elliot would be placed into emergency transitional care until a foster arrangement could be found. A social worker had been notified and was en route. Standard process. Nothing out of the ordinary, except for the fact that it was everything that should never be ordinary. Grayson stared at the desk, then at the hallway where the boy still sat on the bench, alone, still quiet, still small, still left behind. Something inside Grayson fractured, not a break, but a shift. He didn't ask for permission. He demanded emergency temporary guardianship. The clerk had protested at first, citing background checks and procedural requirements. Grayson countered with legal credentials, fast-tracked review, and the name of the judge who could authorize an expedited order. When money wasn't enough, he offered his time. When status wasn't enough, he offered presence. In less than 90 minutes, the paperwork was filed. Background clearances were begun. An interview was scheduled within 48 hours. By late afternoon, Grayson Holt, a man whose closest attachment was to commercial real estate, walked out of the courthouse holding the hand of a child he had met that morning. He didn't speak as they exited the building. Elliot didn't ask where they were going. In the car, the boy sat in silence, eyes fixed on the passing world as if it belonged to someone else. His hands never left the backpack in his lap. Grayson drove himself, a rare break from his usual chauffeured routine, because somehow this moment demanded more than delegation. The boy had been given away like a forgotten object, and something about that had ignited a rage inside him that was still quietly burning. When they reached Grayson's penthouse, Elliot followed him in without hesitation, but also without curiosity. The child moved like someone used to temporary places, someone who had learned that new spaces did not mean new safety. Grayson showed him around the apartment, minimalist, vast, polished to perfection. A place built for solitude, for curated impressions, for control, not for childhood, not for healing. Elliot said nothing. He placed his backpack carefully near the corner of the guest room and stood beside the window, watching as the daylight softened into dusk. He didn't ask for food. He didn't look for toys. He simply stood there, as if waiting to be forgotten again. Grayson, a man who had built towers from nothing and revived entire city blocks, found himself standing in the hallway, utterly uncertain of what to do next. He had made the decision on instinct, but now faced the quiet reality of it. A child had entered his life not with a cry, but with a whisper of abandonment. And now, nothing felt more urgent or more impossible than making that whisper fade. He sat in the hallway long after Elliot had gone to bed. The guest room was silent. The whole apartment was too quiet, too controlled. He stared at the closed door, and for the first time in a long while, Grayson Holt didn't think about investors or zoning contracts or expansion plans. He thought about a little boy who had been given away, and how a single moment, a glance, a voice, a whisper, had rewritten everything he thought he knew about responsibility. The morning after Elliot arrived, the penthouse felt different. It wasn't that anything had changed physically. The furniture remained in perfect alignment, the artwork still sat undisturbed, and the glass walls still overlooked the sparkling sprawl of the city below. But the air was heavier. It moved differently, as if the silence had taken on substance and weight. Grayson woke earlier than usual, not because of any alarm, but because something in him refused to rest. He sat on the edge of his bed, listening for sounds he didn't know how to interpret. He wasn't even sure what he expected. A child's cry? Footsteps? Nothing came. He walked through the apartment barefoot, his movements unusually quiet for a man so used to commanding spaces. When he reached the guest room, he paused at the door. It was ajar by an inch. Inside, the boy was curled beneath the white comforter like a question mark, his backpack still clutched in one hand. The stuffed rabbit Grayson had placed near the pillow the night before, a spontaneous purchase from a convenience store on the way home, remained untouched. He left the door open and headed to the kitchen. Breakfast was a practical affair. Toast, scrambled eggs, sliced apple. Nothing fancy, but arranged with a kind of careful intention Grayson didn't usually apply to domestic life. He set the plate on the kitchen island and poured a glass of water beside it. He didn't call Elliot. He didn't knock. He just sat in silence, drinking his own coffee, waiting. It was 20 minutes before the boy appeared. Still in the same clothes from the day before, Elliot shuffled slowly into the room, eyes wide but expressionless. He didn't ask questions. He didn't look around. He simply sat on the stool in front of the plate and began to eat, one small bite at a time, like someone unfamiliar with certainty. Grayson watched him closely. The boy didn't waste motion. He didn't fidget. He chewed with care, as if rationing the food in case it disappeared again. He didn't ask for seconds, though his hunger was clear. When he finished, he pushed the plate slightly forward and lowered his eyes. The morning passed in a kind of delicate balance. Elliot remained silent but alert, observing everything with that same quiet detachment. Grayson tried to fill the hours, showing him the living room, the balcony, the home office, but the boy responded only with polite stillness. He neither reached for things nor recoiled. He simply existed. And the apartment, once a testament to minimalism and discipline, now felt hollow. Grayson had built this space as a reflection of himself, clean, precise, controlled. Now, standing in the middle of his immaculate living room, he realized how profoundly incompatible it was with the needs of a child. There were no soft edges, no books with torn covers, no small fingerprints on glass, no chaos, no signs of life. He spent the afternoon on his phone, canceling meetings, pushing deadlines. His assistant didn't ask questions, only noted the tone in his voice and adjusted accordingly. By evening, the apartment was quiet again, the only sound the distant hum of the city beyond the windows. Elliot sat on the floor beside the wall-length glass pane, legs crossed, gaze fixed on the streets far below. He hadn't spoken all day, not one word, not a sound. Grayson brought him a small plate of dinner and placed it near him without commentary. The boy ate without looking up. When he finished, he returned to the same position, staring through the glass as if searching for something familiar in the grid of headlights. That night, after Elliot fell asleep with his rabbit finally under one arm, Grayson walked through the apartment slowly. He paused at the guest room doorway again. There were no nightlights, no toys, no softness. The room was functional, but function was not what children needed. He opened his laptop and began searching. He read articles about trauma, early childhood abandonment, and foster care integration. He watched videos from child psychologists and scanned product listings for comforters with stars, for storybooks with large illustrations, for nightlights shaped like the moon. The next day, deliveries began to arrive. A quilt in soft earth tones, a shelf of picture books, a set of washable markers, a beanbag chair, a lamp shaped like a small rocket. Elliot didn't touch any of it, but he didn't ask for it to be removed either. That was something. Grayson found himself adjusting in ways he hadn't anticipated. He stopped listening to the financial news during breakfast. He turned off his phone more often. He spoke slower, moved more deliberately. He had never been a father, never planned to be, but now every decision he made was filtered through the lens of that small figure walking silently through his apartment. He rearranged his office to fit a small desk and some books. He cooked more, even when Elliot had only a few bites. He began documenting Elliot's sleep habits, noting the times he stirred, the nights he whimpered in his sleep. He reached out to a pediatric therapist and scheduled an evaluation. Elliot remained quiet but observant. Sometimes Grayson would find him standing by the window in the middle of the night, holding his rabbit, staring at the lights. He didn't ask questions. He didn't cry. But the silence he wore wasn't peace. It was armor. And Grayson, a man who had conquered markets, cities, and political resistance, found himself facing his most complex challenge: the silence of a child learning to trust the world again. One morning, a week after Elliot's arrival, something changed. The boy came into the kitchen before Grayson could call him. He didn't sit at the island this time. He stood nearby and watched as Grayson scrambled eggs and plated toast. Then, slowly, he sat down without being prompted. Grayson placed the plate in front of him and turned to pour coffee. That's when he heard it, a sound so faint it nearly passed unnoticed. A hum, not a melody, not a song, just a soft, low hum, the kind children make when they are calm, when they feel, even for a moment, safe. It lasted only a few seconds, but it broke something open in Grayson's chest. He didn't comment. He didn't react. He just stood there, holding his mug, and felt a strange warmth rise in him, something unfamiliar but deeply right. Elliot finished his food, placed the fork down neatly, and looked up, not directly at Grayson, but near him. Still not speaking, but no longer hiding. It wasn't progress the way reports measured it, but to Grayson it was monumental. That night, Grayson lay in bed with the lights off, staring at the ceiling. His phone buzzed with pending contracts, his calendar with meetings postponed, but he didn't reach for any of it. Instead, he thought about how a boy had walked into his life with nothing but a backpack and silence. And now that silence was beginning to shift. It was no longer the sound of despair. It was the sound of possibility. It had been nearly a month since Elliot came to live with Grayson. The penthouse had transformed in small, meaningful ways. There were now stray crayons under the coffee table, paper airplanes resting on windowsills, and a stuffed rabbit with one ear torn lying like a guardian beside a neatly made bed. The living room, once an exhibition of sharp lines and minimalist art, bore the subtle marks of new life. Drawings taped to the fridge, a child-sized hoodie draped over the arm of the couch, a pair of Velcro sneakers left near the door, and laughter. Soft, infrequent but unmistakable. It came in flickers, when Grayson burned toast and pretended it was gourmet, when Elliot's rabbit was given a voice and began narrating bedtime stories, when Grayson sat on the floor after dinner trying to assemble a toy car with the wrong instructions. The laughter never lasted long, but it lingered in the air like the first scent of spring after a long, bitter winter. Elliot didn't speak often, but he had begun to engage. He joined Grayson in the kitchen. He pointed at things in books. He drew pictures with labels scrawled in unsteady capital letters. He had started greeting Grayson in the morning with a quiet nod, a small ritual that felt more powerful than any spoken word. Grayson, in turn, had built his days around the boy. Meetings were rescheduled. Investors learned to expect silence during drop-offs and therapy appointments. His team whispered about the changes, but no one dared question him. Not because of fear, but because they sensed that something sacred was unfolding, something that existed beyond spreadsheets and projections. But then came the call. A Thursday morning. Grayson was at his desk, overlooking the skyline, sipping his second coffee. His calendar was unusually light that day. He was considering taking Elliot to the bookstore later, maybe pick out a new series of early readers. The boy had begun showing interest in animals and outer space. Grayson had bookmarked a few options. The call came from a number he didn't recognize. A woman introduced herself. Carla Benson, Family Services. She spoke in a calm, practiced voice, explaining that Elliot's biological mother had filed a petition to reinstate her parental rights. Grayson didn't respond at first. The words felt like static. She explained the procedure. Under state law, a parent who relinquished custody could file for reinstatement under specific circumstances: proof of rehabilitation, a stable living arrangement, employment efforts. The mother, whose name Grayson barely remembered from the original file, had completed a 6-week drug rehabilitation program and recently moved into a subsidized apartment in the city. She had met the minimum legal threshold. A hearing had been scheduled. The court was obligated to consider her petition. Grayson ended the call and sat still, his coffee forgotten. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent, fast, loud. Inside, the penthouse was quiet, still wrapped in morning calm. Elliot was in his room, humming as he colored. The sound twisted something deep inside Grayson's chest. He didn't know the woman. He hadn't seen her since the brief mention in the custody waiver, but the idea of her appearing now, not because she had changed, but because she legally could, it filled him with something cold and sharp. He didn't tell Elliot, not yet. The boy had just begun to build safety in the new rhythm of their days. He had started sleeping through the night. He no longer sat by the window listening for car doors. His rabbit had a name now, Banjo. He had a favorite color, a favorite bowl, a favorite place on the couch. To threaten all of that with one court date was unthinkable. Grayson contacted his legal team. They were caught off guard. Some of them advised him to prepare for loss. The law, they reminded him, favored reunification whenever possible. Blood ties still carried weight. Temporary guardianship didn't ensure permanency. He wasn't the legal father. Not yet. One partner, a friend for nearly a decade, advised him gently to detach, to protect himself. "You've done your part," the man said. "Maybe this isn't your fight." Grayson ended the call mid-sentence. He hired a new attorney the next day, Dana Whitmore, a family law specialist with a reputation for defying precedent. She asked for every document: therapist reports, school observations, guardian updates. She interviewed Grayson personally. She met with Elliot's therapist. She visited the apartment. And she believed him. "This child doesn't need transition," she said during their first strategy meeting. "He needs permanence." They prepared their case in silence, in between breakfast dishes and bedtime stories. Grayson collected everything: photos, progress journals, testimonies. The therapist's notes detailed a boy whose fear had slowly been replaced by cautious hope. The school counselor submitted a letter describing Elliot as quiet but stable, a child clearly attached to his current caregiver. Meanwhile, Elliot sensed the shift, not in words, but in atmosphere. He watched Grayson more closely, checked the front door more often. He didn't ask questions, but his drawings became darker again: rain clouds over stick figures, houses without windows. The rabbit disappeared under the bed. Grayson tried to shield him from the tension, but children knew things. They knew when love was threatened. One evening, Elliot stood in the hallway in his pajamas, rabbit clutched under one arm, and simply watched Grayson without blinking. There was no fear in his eyes, just a silent question. "Are you still here?" Grayson nodded. The child returned to his room. That night, Grayson sat at his desk, staring at the court notice: Friday, 9 a.m. He wasn't sure what the mother would say, if she would cry, if she would pretend to be someone she wasn't, if she even cared. But he knew this. He had been there when Elliot had nothing. When he had sat on a bench with his knees to his chest and said no one wanted him. He had watched that boy rebuild himself inch by inch in a home that had never been meant for children but had become one anyway. He had chosen Elliot. And now he would fight to make sure Elliot could choose him back. The week leading up to the hearing was heavy. Dana visited several times. Grayson submitted to another home inspection. Elliot's therapist prepared a short letter and gently encouraged the boy to draw something that showed how he felt about his home. He drew 3 figures: a man, a child, and a rabbit, standing under a yellow sun. Above them, in unsteady letters, he had written, "My place." Grayson framed the picture. The night before the hearing, Elliot was quiet again. He ate only half his dinner and left his crayons scattered without order. He sat by the window for a long time, rabbit in hand, and eventually fell asleep on the couch. Grayson covered him with a blanket and sat nearby, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. He remembered how, a month ago, he had walked into a courthouse for a routine zoning document, and walked out with a boy whose voice had almost vanished. Now, that boy was everything, and Grayson knew beyond doubt that if he lost him now, there would be no contract, no project, no success that could make the world feel whole again. The courthouse was gray again, just like it had been the morning Grayson first saw Elliot. Rain hung thick in the air, not falling, but threatening, as if the sky itself understood what was at stake. The marble floors gleamed beneath harsh, overhead lights, and the familiar hum of urgency filled the hallways. But this time, Grayson was not alone. Elliot walked beside him, one small hand in his, the other clutching his rabbit, worn but present. A yellow clip held back a stray strand of his hair, a detail arranged by Claire, the gentle counselor who had quietly become a constant in their lives. They had not told Elliot the full details of the hearing, only that he needed to come to court today, only that some people would ask questions, that he would not have to speak if he didn't want to, and that no matter what happened, someone would be beside him the whole time. Claire was already waiting when they arrived. She wore calm like armor, her presence as reassuring as the soft music she often brought into their home. Elliot walked to her without hesitation and held her hand, forming a quiet bridge between the two adults who had come to mean safety. In the waiting area outside the courtroom, Time moved slowly. Elliot sat between them, tracing circles on the bench with his finger. His face was calm, but his shoulders were tight. Grayson watched every small movement, every glance, every breath, and reminded himself to stay grounded. Then the doors opened. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than he remembered, more intimate. There were no spectators today, only legal representatives, a social worker seated behind the petitioner's table, and the judge, an older woman with sharp eyes and a gentle mouth. The kind of judge who had seen everything and still hadn't lost her humanity. Grayson and Dana took their places. Claire and Elliot sat in the designated seating nearby. The boy's feet didn't touch the floor. Then she entered. Elliot's biological mother. Grayson watched her as she crossed the room, a manufactured smile tugging at her lips, her appearance polished just enough to look like effort had been made. She didn't glance at Elliot. She sat down quickly, impatiently, like someone waiting for a delayed bus rather than someone fighting for custody of a child. Dana leaned toward Grayson briefly, whispered a single word, uninvested. The judge opened with procedural remarks. The mother's attorney, a public defender, presented their case first, the completion of a 6-week rehabilitation program, a verified subsidized housing unit, proof of job applications submitted. It was the minimum required, and barely that. The mother didn't speak until prompted. When asked if she had anything to say to the court or to her child, she shrugged. "He's still young," she said. "He'll adjust." Grayson felt something inside him recoil. No emotion, no apology, just a calculated bid for return, driven by something other than love. A checkbox on a list, a legal maneuver. Then it was Dana's turn. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize. She simply laid out the facts. Elliot's trauma upon arrival, his progress since, the reports from his therapist, his drawings, his new routine, his sense of safety. She submitted photos, not posed but real. Elliot asleep on the couch with his rabbit. Elliot at the table with paint on his hands. Elliot in the backyard garden, standing beneath the bloomin' lavender that Claire had helped him plant. And then, quietly, she submitted a letter from the therapist. It wasn't long. Just a few paragraphs, a professional observation that the child now associated stability, safety, and emotional grounding with the home he had found, not with the one he had lost. At the end of the letter, a sentence stood out. "In my opinion, a return to the biological parent would not constitute reunification. It would constitute re-traumatization." The courtroom was silent. The judge turned to Grayson, asked him if he understood the gravity of what he was requesting, a permanent severance of parental rights, a permanent adoption, a legal commitment to a life, not a temporary act of kindness. He said yes, not with grand gestures, not with speeches, just yes. And then the judge asked Elliot. The boy was small in his chair, too small for such a question, but the judge didn't force him to speak. She simply asked if he would like to stay where he was. Elliot looked at Grayson, then at Claire, then down at his rabbit. He nodded, and that was enough. The gavel came down. The words were clear, simple, and final. Custody shall remain with Mr. Grayson Holt. Parental rights of the petitioner are terminated. Mr. Holt may proceed with formal adoption. There was no applause, no celebration, just the quiet sound of a breath being released, from Grayson, from Claire, and most of all from Elliot. He turned to Grayson and whispered the only words that mattered. "I don't have to leave?" Grayson leaned down and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You're staying home." The ride home was quiet, not tense, not heavy, just quiet in the way that comes after a storm. Elliot sat in the back seat staring out the window, rabbit in hand. Claire sat beside him, one hand resting gently over his. Grayson drove, both hands steady on the wheel, the city unfolding before them in slow, forgiving light. The apartment had changed, subtly but unmistakably. There was a lavender comforter on Elliot's bed, a wall of his drawings, a new bookshelf filled with beginner science books and animal encyclopedias. The fridge held more fruit than wine. The living room had a basket of toys. There were fingerprints on the glass. It looked like someone lived there, like a family did. That weekend, Claire arrived with a basket of muffins and a suggestion to plant more herbs on the balcony. Elliot nodded enthusiastically and chose mint and basil. He spent the morning pressing soil around the tiny roots, his sleeves rolled up, his face streaked with smudges of joy. Later that day, Grayson filed the first formal papers to begin the adoption process. He didn't tell Elliot yet. He wanted to wait until it was official, until he could say the words without legal hesitation, until he could hand the boy a certificate that meant what they both already knew. That night, Elliot walked into the living room, Rabbit tucked under one arm, and paused in front of the couch. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, thinking. Then, after a long silence, he looked up at Grayson. He asked if he could call him Dad. Grayson, stunned, nodded. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it echoed in his chest with more force than any business deal ever had. A few weeks later, Grayson stood in the same courtroom again. This time with papers in his hands, with Elliot in a freshly pressed shirt and Claire beside them both. The judge smiled as she signed the adoption order. "From this day forward," she said, "the child shall be known as Elliot Holt." There were no cameras, no reporters, just three people standing together, framed by a moment that changed everything. That evening, back at the apartment, Elliot taped a new drawing to the fridge. 3 figures, one tall, one medium, one small, a rabbit nearby. Above it, written in uneven but proud letters, "My Real Family." If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this. And let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? Your voice matters here,